I'll start with this story that was just in Polish Newsweek. A pretty typical headline these days. Trucks with timber cross the gate on the power plant every few minutes. 20 hectares of forest are going up in smoke here every day. This is a very large wood-burning power station in Poland, Polaniak Station. In 2021, it got over 65 million euro in subsidies to burn wood. And it is unequivocally burning trees. It's not burning sawdust, it's burning trees that are cut down in the forest. You can see them piled up there in the picture and on the back of the truck. And I've put the link to the article, and of course anyone can request these references from us later. So that's not an isolated example. Here's some examples of biomass burned around the EU. We either took these pictures, us and our colleagues took these pictures, or we got them, we put out a whole report on power plants and wood pellet plants using large stem wood. As you can see, we've got Austria, Slovakia, we've got the United States there. There's pellet plants in the United States that are providing pellets to the EU and the UK, Canada as well, Portugal, Germany, Estonia. These are all pellet plants or wood biomass plants, energy plants. Next slide, please. European statistical data shows that Europe is burning a lot of wood. Solid biofuels includes a lot of different kinds of biomass, but all wood is there in the dotted line. You can see through time how it's gone from 1990 to 2020. Great increase. About half of wood that's burned is forest biomass, that's primary woody biomass. We are asking the European Union, we've been helping run a campaign to get policymakers to take primary woody biomass out of the Renewable Energy Directive as renewable energy. And as you can see, the next kind of renewable energy that is below wood is wind. So in terms of absolute energy input, it's massively biomass. And then everything else is less than that, wind, solar, geothermal. Now, on a useful energy basis, it's different, but that's what the energy inputs look like. Next slide, please. This is how it's being used and where it's being used. So this is solid biomass consumption by sector in the EU, and it's the purple. The dark purple is electricity-only plants. The light purple is heat and combined heat and power. The green is industrial use, and the dark brown at the bottom is residential wood burning. So really important take-home message here is that all of this wood burning is counted as renewable energy, and yet the majority of it is actually being burned in people's homes. Next slide. And here's a great story that just came out that I highly recommend. I don't have time to talk about it, but I put the link there. I highly recommend that people take a look at this great Euractiv story that came out just a couple of days ago. Next slide, please. Incidentally, residential wood burning is the largest source of particulate pollution. Particulate pollution kills over 1,000 people per day in the EU, per day, and that was pre-COVID. So the majority of particulate matter is coming from wood burning, which is mostly wood, residential solid burning, fuel burning. Next slide, please. Cutting trees to make energy is massively inefficient. This is a series of repeat images from North America where the pellet plants are that are making these pellets that are coming to the EU. And you can see a hardwood forest, and then just after having been clear cut, and then 5 years later, that beautiful hardwood forest, which was teeming with animals and plants, has now been replaced with a pine plantation, all perfectly legal under EU rules. And the wood from that 27-hectare clear cut would run the Drax power plant in the UK for 3 hours and 24 minutes. Next slide, please. We see this all over the place, this kind of destructive cutting. Estonia, clear cutting massively peaty soils that not only does cutting and burning the trees release carbon, but these soils are effectively a carbon bomb. Next slide. North Carolina, there's a beautiful wetland. Colleagues of ours at Dogwood Alliance went to this cut. They saw the logs getting loaded onto the trucks. They followed the trucks back to the pellet plant. This is a beautiful wetland, or was. Next slide. New York Times covered massive forest cutting, illegal cutting in Romania recently, showing that, and again, followed the trucks back to the pellet plant, watching these pellets get shipped all over the EU as renewable energy. This is a fantastic story. I highly recommend. I have a link to see it without a subscription, so just ask me, I'll send it to you. Next slide, please. And here's some repeat imagery that they did of beautiful Carpathian mountain forests through time, clear cuts, expanding, just the ugliest thing you could possibly imagine, and all being done in the name of clean renewable energy. Next slide. And finally, British Columbia and Canada, where we've just done a showing of a BBC documentary showing that Drax, the pellet part of Drax, is in there cutting primary forests and turning them into pellets and shipping them all over the world. Next slide. Achieving EU climate goals is going to require reducing emissions, but burning wood for energy emits more CO2 than coal or gas at the smokestack. That's just the data. There's nothing magical happening here. It's just everyone agrees on that. It's nothing controversial. Next slide. You missed one. Go back. Burning biomass increases net emissions compared to fossil fuels, so it's not just what's coming out the smokestack, but the fact that burning, trees grow slowly and burning wood emits CO2 quickly. So the European Commission's impact assessment said that an immediate increase in greenhouse gas emissions compared to using fossil fuels is almost inevitable. The initial period of increased GHG emissions can vary from less than 1 year to hundreds of years, or even to infinity in the worst cases. This is the European Commission's own scientists. This data and these conclusions have been available to European policymakers for years, and yet they are persisting during RED 3 in continuing to treat burning trees as renewable energy. Next slide. Achieving EU climate goals and planetary climate goals requires increasing the forest carbon sink, but it's actually decreasing. It's getting weaker, less negative. That's what that red arrow pointing up shows. Next slide. And we see a connection between use of biomass and the collapse of the forest carbon sink. So we have biomass use in the top graphs, and then the green line in the bottom graph is the forest sink, and the purple line is the land sink as a whole. You can see it's collapsed in Austria, contemporaneous with a major increase in biomass. About half the wood being cut in the EU is burned for biomass, so this isn't really surprising. Germany as well, also a major decline in the forest carbon sink. Next slide. Estonia and Latvia have also are major pellet exporters. That's what the yellow wedges in the top is, and it's showing how that's increasing and the forest carbon sink has decreased drastically. Next slide. Finland has lost its sink, and this was related to biomass as well, as the researchers tell us. Over-harvesting for biomass. Next slide. The European Commission's Joint Research Center biomass report finds that burning forestry residues is high risk for biodiversity and climate. And that's stem wood. Anything greater than 10 centimeters at its thinnest end is high risk for biodiversity and climate. Next slide. Despite that, biomass is treated as having zero emissions under official policy, and it's getting around $17 billion a year in subsidies. Next slide. Scientists and NGOs call on EU policymakers to follow the science. We recently had an encouraging quote from Environment Commissioner Sinkevicius, sorry for that, where he has said that burning wood should not be treated as renewable energy. Next slide. There's my contact information and a little kitty cat sitting underneath my bird feeder waiting for a bird to come by, or a squirrel. That's a Massachusetts bobcat.
Okay, yeah. As you said, I'm a forester, and I watched the forest business since 3 decades, and I get more and more the impression that the forest sector is acting like the oil business in the 1970s. Forest business is a little bit slowly, And nowadays they use the same arguments. They know that burning wood is not carbon neutral, but even state forestry administrations have on their webpage, say on their webpage that burning wood is carbon neutral. We say, okay, that's a lie from state forestry authorities. I think in the year 2023 that shouldn't be possible. That is very dangerous for us all, and that are the authorities which have to control the use of forest, and they should control if the laws are regarded and so on. So perhaps we take a closer look what they have done to our forest. First, sustainability was not invented by forestry, it was invented by the mining industry. So they have even stolen the story. Everyone believes it. And we take a close look what they mean if they say we are sustainable and we don't cut more timber, more trees than will regrow. First, forest in major parts of Europe look like this. This is a primary forest in Romania, of course, because in Germany sustainability or sustainable forestry hasn't left a single square meter of such forest. So such a forest doesn't just contain, in this special case, for example, 1,600 cubic meters above biomass, and in the underground perhaps the same amount, but rich biodiversity, and such a forest is wonderful. In the moment we discuss forest as carbon sinks or as a source of energy. And that makes me sad, because what is our life about? It's about earning money, it's about having a warm home, or it's about to have a happy life. And in the moment it's about business. And it's sad that we have to make a price tag on such forest to save them. I've talked to the Iranian forest chief, and when he visited our home forest, he said, why are we just talking about money when we talk about saving forests? But in Germany, or in Europe in general, or all over the world, it's just working like that. And we should change that too. So we see what 300 years sustainable forestry has made of such forest. Most of the forest, meanwhile, looks like this. They are green deserts. They are ready to harvest with machines, but it's taken decades, and the industrial forestry was much slower than the industrial sector in general. So the industrial forestry heavily arrived around 1990 with big machines, and it's still increasing. And the state forest authorities, they have remembered by the German High Court 2 times not to see timber as the timber delivery as the first aim. It's forbidden by law, and they don't care. And I think that's very risky for a democracy. The executive persons are not regarding laws. And we don't have a control authority because they control what's going on in the forest. And now we see that this plantation system, and that are just plantations that took years to bring the word into the German technical terms, because plantations, that's something for southern countries, not for developed countries like Europe. And so what we see now is that nature shows us that it doesn't work any longer. Climate change is a big problem. And now we have the narrative that the climate change is destroying forest, or bark beetles are destroying forest. No, forestry is destroying forest. Because dead trees doesn't mean dead forest. We have squirrels, we have woodpeckers, we have insects, we have fungi, it's all still there. But if we remove the biomass, then they are mostly gone. And the narrative in the public is, it's like a warehouse, we have to empty it and start it again. And so our goods have to be sold, and if this is biomass which we get paid for, it's better than nothing, because otherwise all those creatures would feed on this biomass, they would breathe out CO2, and it's better to have this CO2 emissions by the fire. And I think that's really crazy, heavy to stand this. And what you see, here's another example from Germany. But as if I saw your pictures, when I saw your pictures, it doesn't matter if this is from Canada, from Sweden, from Poland. They all look the same. And if you talk to people from NGOs, every second sentence is, oh, it's exactly the same in our country. Because it's meanwhile all over the world the same forestry system. Here we see a clear cut from a wildfire, but the biomass at St. Paul-Brixen was still there. It was clear cut afterwards, and the whole ground fluffed. And now we are at the end point of forestry. It's agriculture, as it was when it was invented. But in between, forestry pretended to be green. And meanwhile, we see what it was worth nothing. We are back, it's like crop. And the soil is destroyed, it's not able to store this large amount of water, and I will come back 1 minute later on this very important point. Here we see what is even more sad. It's a clear cut in a protected area, and the State Forestry Administration has caused a clear cut several square kilometers in a protected area, and this is illegal. And we brought it to a state attorney, and they refused to research it. So Germany hasn't a working court system because we are not aware that even the state can commit crimes. It's not possible to punish them because they say, we don't care, so what? That's exactly the point where we are in the moment. And what they also caused, the population died because of bad management in combination with climate change. And the result is, okay, we make an explantation with Douglas fir, non-native Douglas fir. Okay, so the forest will be kept in a very bad state. And which is, it's getting even more worse. Here we see old beech and oak forests. We don't have primeval forest, but we have old beech and oak forest in an okay condition. And by destroying the soil, by treating with big machines, compressing the soil, the winter rain won't be stored anymore in the soil, and the winter rain is the most important rain for all trees, which we know meanwhile. So these trees are suffering, and if foresters see those trees like this oak tree here is suffering, so we can make a sanitary cut, because this tree is dying. Although it's recovering, but it's dying, okay. So people say, yeah, okay, that's okay. So we can burn them. And if we earn a little money just to get our costs back for cutting them, then it will be okay. So if we open the door for subsidizing wood biomass for burning in power plants, then we will also lose our old beech and oak forest. And we see that in increasing speed. And if we don't do it like this, forest dying plantations could look like this. Nature is recovering. It's in the moment, we don't know how long it will work, but in the moment, this plantation can change into natural forest without or with just a little cost. But if we remove this woody biomass and burn them in power plants, we lose even this chance. So I will finish with a better picture, a nicer picture. Sorry, yeah. And I can say forest industry is not able to discipline itself. So we need watertight rules, and without exception, which says don't burn any woody biomass from forest.
Thanks a lot, Tanja, for the nice introduction. Thanks for having me here at this event. I would like to continue like where Peter just has stopped. Well, you said that forestry has not left a single square meter like primary forest. I would like to show you one. This is north of Berlin, not far away from here, but it's only actually square meters. It's a few hectares big, an old beech forest where we can appreciate many things. We could talk an hour about this picture and the situation alone. What we can see is there never ever can be too much biomass in a forest. And a forest never has to get rid of wood biomass. There is no waste in the forest. Yeah? The more biomass we have living, dead, decaying, decomposed, the more functional the forest becomes. So this would be a point that we have to take into account maybe a little more seriously, and in a way also decarbonize our discourse on forests. It's a little more than just carbon storage and zinc and so on. It's a living ecosystem which gets better over time, accumulating biomass, information, and networks. So this is the contrast in. Similar, we've seen something like that. We just took this picture a few weeks ago in Eberswalde, where our university is based, where we have a wood power plant, and where we can see, it's not true what is always communicated, no, that we only burn waste wood, whatever waste would be, but it's old trees. If we go closer, we don't have time to count all the tree rings now, but believe me, this is many decades old. Oak in this case, we have old beech and so on and so forth. They have been healthy and they are burned. This is another picture. This tree has been felled by Knut Storm. Ordinary, very careful, ecologically adaptive harvesting, where we could see, if we got closer to the tree rings, actually it's interesting. The further we go from the center, which are the earliest tree rings, and then to the periphery, the tree rings become wider. What does it mean? The tree is accumulating ever more biomass the older it gets. And there's quite a lot of evidence about that. Trees are getting older and getting better. Older forests become more efficient in accumulating and storing carbon. By the way, also shown in this paper by Hans Ibisch, where we have the accumulation of biomass over time related to tree age, and look at the tree ages, 100, 150, 200, and there is not a linear relationship, but it's a curve, it's going upwards, and this is the science, and forest scientists had to call this paper here because of tree growth theory and reality, and often we got things that are communicated by forestry that are completely not in line with these results. So also old forests accumulate permanently carbon, even if we look only at the biomass, at the living and the dead biomass. This would not take into account the soil carbon, which is getting ever more important in old, mature soils, that can take up a lot of carbon even in deeper soils, which often are not analyzed if we look at the soil carbon. So over time, 300-400 years, there is a steady, maybe not increase of the sequestration rate, the uptake, but there is a steady uptake of carbon in these systems. So we have these simple things that are communicated for years now in many scientific papers. When we reduce the biomass stock of a forest, it will grow back, but we are creating a carbon debt, and this will take time to come back, and it will depend on how much we take out of the forest. If we really reduce it to a very young age, it will take longer, and as we've just seen, the biomass accumulation rate is lower. And it's not true to say only if we cut the trees we have sequestration of carbon. And there are some complications related to the assumption, of course, that you can do this all the time. Cut, grow back, cut and grow back. It has been mentioned. When we have such a situation, it has been highlighted before by Peter, the story is over. So here the plantation has just abruptly stopped sequestrating carbon. amongst others. Then there are some ecological consequences that we also have to address. You know, what does this do to the landscapes? But still, I mean, there are the numbers. We have now the sea trees assessment, which allows global understanding that we have the first regions in the world, in Germany as well, North Rhine-Westphalia, for example, which has become a carbon source. Even if we only take into account the above and below ground biomass, not talking about the soils. So last 20 years, and there's a decline of the carbon stock. And this is based on, well, it will caused by the dieback in spruces, but we have more species, more forest types, plantation types, which can go in decline very soon, such as pines. Yeah? Can be in Germany the next spruce calamity. And yeah, we have a lot of also more close in nature forests being affected. It has been mentioned, but yeah, it's has been highlighted by Peter. Then subtle but clear combination of climate extremes or weather extremes and the intensive forest use. And it's easy, really, we see this now everywhere, to convert a functional high forest into a shrubland. And this is a realistic scenario for a wider landscape in Germany. And then, yeah, okay, ecologically speaking, we have to address the soil carbon, for example, that's lost when we have such a clear cut, which is then warming up a lot on hot days, enormously, 20 degrees more than in a functional forest, very extreme temperatures, killing of microorganisms, mycorrhiza, and so on, and reducing the potential of such an area for recovery. Yeah? And the larger the areas are, and the more extreme we treat them with this extreme salvage logging, extracting actually all biomass, the more we reduce the functionality and the resilience of the forest and of the ecosystem. So this might change the landscape, and it can be measured. So things we are doing here with a simple infrared camera on a drone, you can see the temperatures of different types of forest, and which then means actually when we reduce biomass in the landscape, the remnant forest will be exposed to ever more extreme edge effects. More heat means more drought, means more physical damage of all the organisms. And this is now an escalation, which is starting in Germany, where we talk about 500,000 hectares of salvage marked calamity areas. Okay, then we replant, that being said, but what if the trees refuse to regrow, such as the Douglas fir, future trees promising introduced species may not be fine with these environmental conditions. Practices that always worked. We have all over Europe forestry based on clear cutting in many countries, Scandinavia, 80–90%, the Baltic states and others, even in Germany now it's increasing. What if the future conditions will not allow for regrowth? If you look at this clear cut here in Romania, so this is 10 years old. This has been converted from forest or plantation, Garden spruce forest, into a grassland, which is nice as well, maybe for bisons and so on. Some species will be happy, but this area has lost the functions of the forest and also the ecosystem services. Well, we have so much evidence about the forest suffering from climate change itself, so it's not right to communicate that forests are only the savior and the champion that will counteract climate change. Forest ecosystems are impacted, and we have these signals of declining forest resilience all over the world. In some regions more than others. Europe is currently the continent which is warming faster than all other regions, and we have problems with not only maximum values, high temperatures that will reduce efficiency of photosynthesis, but also drives, as we know, the loss of defense. We get an increase of insect calamities, we get more fires, and so on and so forth simultaneously. And okay, so coming back to the graph, yes, you can cut and it will grow back and cut and so on and forever. There is not too much evidence, if we are honest, as forestry is not too old, so we are managing these ecosystems yeah, for a few hundreds of years. Sometimes they have been cut only twice or three times, and so no evidence that this will go on forever. But if we then come now to these extreme conditions, well, there are questions. Yeah? And so what is sustainable in times of climate crisis? What if, no? I mean, the current years, the most extreme ones, the hottest decade we've seen since 1815 will be relatively cool when we look back in 10 or 20 years. So it's actually now in the face of this crisis irresponsible to cut down these ecosystems which are cooling the landscapes, which are providing ecosystem services that we may value much more than today, and which are much more than just carbon. Thank you very much.